For the first time ever, I've been doing this for 60 years. I've never heard of anybody saying we really can't pick between the candidates. But there are people saying, I don't know who I'm going to vote against. They know they're not going to vote for either candidate, but they're not sure who they'll vote against.
Well, first of all, what do you make of this accusation of the Labour Party somehow interfering in the US election by helping the Harris campaign? Is this a serious issue?
It's an issue of policy. It's an issue of what's the best practice, but it's not a serious issue of law. Legally, it's probably permissible for people from one country to try to interfere in an election of another country. It probably doesn't have much of an effect, and it probably sends a dangerous message. It's best if countries stick to their own politics and not interfere into the politics of others. But legally, I don't see any real problem.
Just to be clear as to what the law does say in the US around this, you are allowed to volunteer. A foreign national is allowed to volunteer for a campaign, but you can't receive any form of payment or even any compensation if it's more than $1,000. Is that correct?
That's correct. But more seriously, you cannot make a contribution. And there are some who are arguing that by paying their airfare coming over, that constitutes a contribution of funds and of time. Of course, we know that in the United States, we did the exact same thing. One of our senators, Sanders, went over to campaign for Jeremy Corbyn, and he did it presumably in his own expense. And so I think it's bad policy to do, but this, we try to make everything illegal now. We try to weaponize our justice system to turn what are immoral acts, perhaps, or politically unwise acts into criminal acts. And I'm strongly opposed to that. And so I don't think that we ought to be having Justice Department investigations of this, but we ought to ignore it. When people from other countries come and try to influence our elections, the message ought to be we're not interested.
So is there any grounding to the Trump campaign's complaint to the Federal Election Commission?
I don't think so. I think that their complaint ought to be to the political people in Great Britain and perhaps to the voters in America. But, ignore what's going on, keep your people home. But I don't think this should give rise to a legal issue. We also see another legal issue now. Obviously, we know that Elon Musk is being investigated by the Justice Department for offering a lottery in which you can win $1 million for signing a petition in favor of free speech and free access to guns. Again, I don't think it's something the Justice Department should be looking into. It's something that in general should be frowned on. But there's a big difference between acts that are wrong politically and acts that give rise to criminal prosecution. We're seeing too many criminal prosecutions growing out of this election, previous elections. In general, it ought to be left to the voters to decide what's right and what's wrong.
And in your view, is there any distinction between Labour Party staffers volunteering for the Kamala Harris campaign and, say, Nigel Farage campaigning for Donald Trump?
No, I think it's pretty much the same. And Donald Trump also essentially campaigned for Nigel Farage. He went on his radio show and he let it be known. And I think also there was no doubt that Trump wanted Johnson, Johnson wanted Trump. There are issues involving Israel all the time. Did Obama really want to defeat Netanyahu? Does Netanyahu want to see Trump winning? These are all in the areas of politics. But again, the voters should make the decision as to whether they approve or disapprove. We're seeing a lot of it. It's probably not good policy.
You know Donald Trump, Alan. He is one of your former clients. Do you think he will move on from this? If he were to return to the White House, would he kiss and make up, so to speak, with Keir Starmer, or will he hold a grudge?
Well, I don't really know Donald Trump well. I defended him once in an unconstitutional impeachment. I'm not a supporter of his politically. He does hold grudges. And I have no doubt that this is not something that he will forget. He does not forget. He remembers people who are for him and people who are against him. And he does hold grudges. I have no doubt about that. He does them openly. I suspect that a lot of other politicians hold grudges, but they're more discreet.
But I suppose the people who have previously been very critical of Donald Trump and are now in his favour, have had to do a lot of sucking up to him in the meantime. J.D. Vance, for example, his running mate, once called him America's Hitler. Now
Right.
he's on his presidential ticket. So if Keir Starmer wants to get back in his good books, is he going to have to do a lot of diplomacy?
I think so. And I think that diplomacy doesn't always succeed with Donald Trump. His memories of the past sometimes overwhelm his considerations of the current and the future. But, we're a long way from seeing Donald Trump as president again. We're not there. And it's certainly possible if he does get elected, he will decide that his legacy requires him to look forward rather than backward. But I wouldn't count on that.
And what is your sense, Alan, on where we are in the presidential contest? Less than 2 weeks to go. A lot of people saying that Trump is gaining momentum. Is that how you see it?
Well, that's certainly the way the Wall Street Journal sees it and some other media see it. I don't see it. I don't have any basis for seeing it. I live, in New York and in Florida, which are not really contested places, and most of my friends are Harris supporters. I do see some switching by Jewish voters, particularly pro-Israel voters, who used to vote Democrat all the time are now voting Republican. I also hear about people staying home for the first time. For the first time ever, I've been doing this for 60 years. I've never heard of anybody saying, we really can't pick between the candidates. But there are people saying, I don't know who I'm going to vote against. They know they're not going to vote for either candidate, but they're not sure who they'll vote against. And some of them will vote for Nikki Haley or a third party candidate. So, and a lot of people will tell pollsters they're voting against Trump and maybe vote for him. There's been that phenomenon in the two elections that he ran. He did better than the polls suggested he would do. So maybe that's a sign that he might be doing a little better than the pollsters suggest. I think it's too close to call. We still have 2 weeks, although I hate the fact that so many people have already voted. I'm a lawyer. I would hate a juror to vote halfway through my closing argument. I would want him to hear my whole closing argument. And I would hope people would wait until just before the election to cast their vote. But a lot of people are voting now, and we have no idea who they're voting for. So anybody who tells you they know who's going to win this election, I think is blowing smoke.